that's when I think everything changes. And the Mongols look around at what they've done after the death of Genghis Khan and ask themselves, how did we do this? How did this happen that we have all this territory? And that's when I think they try to rationalize it as heaven's will, that Koke Monkey Tingri decreed that they should rule the world. And I at least believe that Ogedei harnessed this idea as an ideology to promote further conquest. And this is where we get the difference between the Mongols and previous steppe empires, in that they intentionally try to conquer and rule over not just the frontiers of nomadic areas, but basically expanding into sedentary lands. And I think that ideology is very, very powerful and serves as sort of a framing effort for basically all the states after the Mongols, well, including, of course, the Mongols, but also non-Mongol states for centuries, really up until probably the 1900s. A Mongol world order that is structuring relationships, but also we have to extend beyond that. It's creating a culture that others will adopt as part of their own ways of establishing their legitimacy. And it also evolves. It's not a stagnant method. So the Mongols are always, shall we say, evolving in how they interact with other states, how they legitimize themselves. And this is, I think, why it's able to last so long, is that they don't just come in and say, well, this is the way it's always been done, and that's how we're going to do it. They change with the times as needed, some better than others.
Hello, everybody. Today we have invited for our podcast Professor Timothy May, a scholar of Mongolian studies, who have issued numerous books about Mongol history, including the Mongols, Mongol world, and the Encyclopedia of Mongolia and Mongol Empire. So we are glad to have him as our host to ask questions that puzzle us all the time in our podcast.
Германд үйлдвэрлэв. Эрүүл мэндэд чанарыг. Denk Farm.
Let me start with a question. Probably nomadic expansion to the rest of the world is not new, and Mongolian expansion is probably third or fourth, if we take into consideration Sunnu or Hans, Turks or Jujans or Avars, to that extension. What is the difference of Mongolian expansion? People say that it was not merely migration of nomads into Europe. Mongolian expansion was something pretty well designed or thought from the very beginning. What is your opinion on that?
Well, the Mongolian expansion is quite different in that it included not just the steppe lands. If you look at the previous empires like the Hunnu and the Turks, most of their territory was mainly in the steppe lands. They did include some sedentary territories, but that was not the main thrust. For the most part, they didn't really try to conquer those areas. They would raid them, and they would gladly accept tribute, but it wasn't like they were trying to come in and occupy them and rule them directly. The Mongols, however, were different. Now, I don't think that Genghis Khan ever intended to conquer the world as he's often portrayed. If you look at his campaigns and really look at what he did in those campaigns, there's really no indication of that. But like with the conquest of the Jin Empire, a lot of it had to do with the fact that the Jin just kept fighting and kept initiating conflict, not always intentionally, perhaps, such as in the treaty around 1214, where the Jin emperor then moved his capital, and the Mongols took this as a provocative action. If we're at peace, why would you move further south? So the war would just keep continuing, and the Jin would keep, resisting, instead of just saying, okay, we'll send you tribute, or we'll have a long established peace. Once you get to Ogadei, that's when I think everything changes, and the Mongols look around at what they've done after the death of Genghis Khan and ask themselves, how did we do this? How did this happen that we have all this territory? And that's when I think they try to rationalize it as heaven's will, that Kokemonke Tingri decreed that they should rule the world. And I at least believe that Ogadei harnessed this idea as an ideology to promote further conquest. And this is where we get the difference between the Mongols and previous steppe empires, in that they intentionally try to conquer and rule over not just the frontiers of nomadic areas, but basically expanding into sedentary lands, and some areas that were not really suitable for large numbers of nomads, and to rule them directly. And we do see migrations, but it's strategic. Basically, we see the migrations of Tama units, or Tama armies, who then go settle in steppe lands. They don't try to occupy cities, but they settle in areas where there's plenty of pasture, where then they can exert influence over regions.
Right. Would you agree with the notion that Mongol conquests were actually World War Zero? Of course, notion of the World War came later, in probably 19th century, with the introduction of Encyclopedia Britannica. But some people claim that it was actually World War Zero, but portrayed by the scholars in separation, conquest of Jin, conquest of Bulgaria, Bulgars, conquest of Russia, etc.
I'm not quite sure how I feel about that concept, because I understand the logic of it. I understand the appeal of it. To say that this is World War Zero. And I think from a Mongol or even Mongolian perspective, yes, you could state that. Mm-hmm. Because the Mongols are operating in multiple theaters. And I do argue that they are operating in theaters of operation. The campaign against the Jin army is one campaign or one theater with Genghis Khan, and then against the Khwarezmians. That's a separate. They have different strategies. They have different plannings. Then you move on with Ogadei. You still have the war with the Jin Empire, but then you have a war in the Middle East under Chormakhan and Deir. And then, of course, a campaign west into the Kipchak steppe and ultimately the Rus and others. That's separate. The operations of Chormakhan actually do connect with that Western campaign, because they make some strategic choices there. But what's different with this, and why I hesitate to say it's World War Zero, is because in World War I, World War II, basically you have groups joining together in alliances against each other. Mm-hmm. We don't really see that. with the Mongol expansion. You don't see like the Jurchen trying to make an alliance with the Khwarezmian Empire, or the Song trying to link up with someone else. And there is an attempt with the Nizari Ismailis in Persia, the assassins trying to make an alliance with European powers against the Mongols. But we have, I want to say it's the Archbishop of Canterbury, but I might be mistaken on that, who says, let them fight each other and then we'll get all of it, basically rejecting any possibility of an alliance. And even when the Mongols do invade Europe, and the European powers, the Holy Roman Empire, the Pope, and others start waking up to the situation, you have the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor pointing fingers at each other at whose fault this is. So there's that difference. But like I said, I understand the appeal. I understand the logic behind calling it that. I just don't know whether I fully can get on board with the idea.
The Russian scholar Lev Gumilev, he suggested that Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Hohenstaufen was in secret alliance with Batu Khan in his invasion into Europe. You may see, of course, some rationale behind, because King Bela was probably supporter of Pope, then Holy Roman Emperor. So he explains the reason why Mongols did not go further into Holy Roman Empire, just limited themselves with Hungary and Poland, Transylvania, etc.
Yeah, I don't think that Frederick was in an alliance with the Mongols. I understand why, and there were accusations against him about that. And there's the popular story that the Mongols, because he was an authority on falconing, that the Mongols offered him a position in the Keshik, the bodyguard, to be a falconer for the Khan. But if you look at Frederick, he is very keen on being an emperor. He likes being an emperor. He likes expanding his territory. If you look at his actions in the Crusades, where he tries to become the ruler of Jerusalem, and does many other actions to enhance his own prestige and power, not always successfully, but I don't see him wanting to be, shall we say, second fiddle to anybody else. But certainly there are plenty of people at that time who would have believed it.
And the fact that Batu Khan retreated from Europe, a lot of historians attribute that to the death of Great Khan Ogodei, but some say that there was no plan for Mongols to invade further, because in 1223, when his granddad Genghis Khan issued an order to Subadei to go to the western lands, he explicitly names around 11 or 12 nations, including Hungarians, but no mention of Germans, Italians, or Franks. That's why some people say that there was simply no plan to go further.
Yeah, at that time, I don't think there was, with Batu's invasion. I think the invasion of Hungary and Poland was strategic. And I've argued this in many of my publications, that the Mongols had a strategy of conquest, which I call the tsunami strategy. I don't know what the Mongols would have called it. We have no record of what it was, but I have deduced this from studying all their campaigns and looking at what they did. And typically what they would do on invasions, beginning with the time of Genghis Khan, and developing over that time, is they would invade an area, destroy a lot, conquer a lot of territory. But then at a certain point, the armies would withdraw. They would not try to occupy all of the territory. But what they would do is they would control some strategic areas like mountain passes, or just a portion of that territory so that they did not overextend. And then what they would do is on the frontiers, this is where they would establish the Tama institutions. And that way the main army could return home or go on other campaigns and not get bogged down into endless wars. And we have to remember that Batu had just conquered a lot of territory, from the Volga River to the Carpathian Mountains. And I think by now we should all realize that it's much easier to conquer than it is to rule.
Mhm.
And Batu, after doing that, he had to organize this new territory with his brothers, establish who's ruling what, set up an infrastructure to tax, and also other commanders are going to be taking, other princes were going to take their troops back. So you can't just keep conquering and conquering, because eventually you're going to run out of troops. But we do see that Guyuk is definitely planning on invading Europe and is planning for a 20-year campaign
Mhm.
before he dies.
Mhm.
But I don't think at the time that Batu had any long-term plans. And the fact that they did not leave troops in Hungary, I think also supports the idea is that what they were doing in Hungary and Poland was basically making a buffer by neutralizing the neighboring enemy so that they would not be threatened by them while they set up their state.
Өмнөд Хятадын халуун ширэнгээс Унгарын их тал хүртэл өргөн уудам нутагт 20 их аяндан удирдах, 65 шийдвэрлэх тулалдаанд ялалт байгуулж, Дэлхийн түүхэнд анх удаа тэв дамсан байлдааны ажиллагааг төлөвлөн амжилтанд хүргэсэн Сүбэдэ Баатрын байлдааны арга барил, агаар газрын байлдаан нэртэй НАТОгийн байлдааны стратеги болон хэрэгжсэн түүхтэй. Энэ гайхамшигт жанжны тухай доктор Отгонбаярын төрөвсөн Сүбэдэ бүтээл хэвлэлтээс гарч уншигч таны гар дээр ирж байна. Домог болсон Монгол жанжныхаа гээгдсэн түүхийг сонирхон уншаарай.
Would you agree with the notion that the Mongol conquests were not simply conquests? All the conquests went along the Silk Route? Because we don't see, sizable inroad by the Mongols into Siberia. Probably there was no trade interesting for them, but usually conquest goes either to the south, conquer to China, or to the west, basically meaning Muslim Asia is one of the biggest market. And if you see 1223 dispatching Jebe and Subutai, the secret history of Mongols say about 3 directions. Genghis Khan is sending Jebe and Subutai to the west, along the western junction of the Silk Route, and then he's sending Chormagan to the Arab world, to the Baghdad Halif, and he's sending Durbe Dakshin to Kashmir, meaning southern end of the Silk Road. Would you agree with that?
I don't think they're trying to conquer the Silk Road. I think it's a not a coincidence, because we have to remember the same roads that caravans are using are the roads and the routes that you would also move an army. Merchants are going to take the most direct route because it's easier.
Sure.
You're going to save money. Armies are going to do the same thing, except if they have, if they choose other strategic reasons, like to avoid certain locations. Dorbe Dokshin, his invasion into what is now Pakistan and a little bit into India was to pursue Jalaluddin. The Mongols had intentions of always hunting down the enemy leader. And Jalaluddin has escaped, so you have to pursue him. And ultimately, they realized that India is not quite to their liking at this time, between the humidity, the heat. And I do wonder, however, if the Sultanate of Delhi, which was also fairly new at the time, might have offered some tribute to deter raids as well. And at that time, Tormakan did not actually go to Baghdad. They talk about that, and I think that that might have been discussed of doing that, but he never did it at that time. We don't have any confirmation that Tormakan went that way at that time, but he was on that campaign and had some knowledge of the region, which is why they selected him as the leader. And Jebe and Subede was definitely, I think, a reconnaissance. I don't think they were out there trying to conquer all that territory, because there's no way they could actually control it with the limited resources. But they were certainly looking at things. They were gathering intelligence for future expansion. But I've heard this argument that the Mongols were trying to control the Silk Road for many, many years. But I don't find that as a convincing argument, simply because it wasn't, I don't see it as a primary reason. It's a benefit, certainly. And the Mongols do understand the value of trade at that time, and controlling it. But at the same time, we see them trying to establish trade relations, like with the Khwarezmian Empire, that unfortunately for the Khwarezmians went terribly wrong. But the Mongols were open to trade from the very beginning, and Genghis Khan was willing to encourage that trade. So I don't think they felt a need. As far as Siberia, there is evidence that the Mongols went much deeper into Siberia than we think. There are hints of it. The problem is that we don't have detailed records from the people that they would have conquered or would have interacted with. There's plenty of trade there because of furs, but also even in the secret history, we see Jafar the merchant taking sheep to trade with the Hoyanirgin in exchange for furs. So we know that there is a lively trade, but also there's plenty of other things. There's grains that are grown in the Yenisei River Basin. There's gold. And there's a good reason why Eric Bolke planned on making that his headquarters after being driven out of Karakoram. The question is just how far did they go? Did they reach all the way to the Arctic Ocean? Maybe not, but they were going much farther than we generally give them credit. If you look at how we draw the maps of the Mongol Empire and where we put the northern border, it was probably farther north than that. Whether it was direct rule or whether tribute relations, where basically they're being paid tribute in furs or something else, we don't know. But again, there are some brief mentions, never a lot of detail, but there is mention of Mongol forces going farther north.
Yeah, probably it is one of the lost chapters of Mongol history. For example, I just recently saw a Yakut movie about their history, and I was surprised to see that Yakuts, they're calling themselves as Orankhais. And I was surprised to learn that in Yakut mythology, they say that Orankhai Elebator went into the river of Lena and married local girl, daughter of Onhabayan, and thus they gave 9 sons, which are the well, beginners of Yakut tribes, etc. And still today, the Republic of Sakha is a Mongolian word of Zakha, outskirts.
Yeah.
So we don't know, because during the Soviet Union, probably there was a deliberate policy of Turkization of those people, including Yakuts, Tuvans, etc. So we don't know yet. My next question would be a question that puzzles me all the time, because no empire would survive without an ideology.
Right.
If you see the Macedonian Empire, which disintegrates immediately after the death of Alexander the Great, but Mongol Empire survives. Genghis Khan, well, as a single entity, probably about 100 years, and then separate states for another 100 years again, trace of which we see until the 20th century. But we don't see any ideology written or somewhere kept. And what would be your proposition toward this effect? Was there an ideology that united this big space in Eurasia?
Yes, I would say so. As I mentioned before, I think by the time of Ögedei Khan, they've developed this idea of heaven's will, that Koke Monke Tingri has bequeathed the earth to the Mongols. And the evidence, as they often say in letters to like the Pope or other rulers, they always describe it as, by the power of heaven, we are doing this. And, I rule from sunrise to sunset. If it wasn't for the will of heaven, how could you explain this? So I think they sincerely believe that. And if someone, when they expand, they do tell people you need to submit. And, when I'm teaching in a class, I always joke that I simplify Mongol diplomacy as you can surrender or you could die. They're happy with either choice. Whatever you want to do, they'll accommodate you. It's a gross simplification, but it gets the point across and makes the students pay attention. But that is because if the Mongols believe in the will of heaven, then it also means that if you do not accept this, then you are in a state of rebellion against the will of heaven. And as the, shall we say, the chosen people, or the enforcers of God, of heaven's will, then the Mongols have to punish you and stop the rebellion. So in a sense, it is sort of a holy war in the expansion. Now, another part of that is an ideology in the virtue or the legitimacy of the Chinggisids, of the descendants of Genghis Khan. When Genghis Khan unified the steppes of Mongolia, he did an excellent job of eradicating other lineages of aristocrats, people who might be an alternative to him and his family. And of course, over time, there's pruning of the Chinggisid line as far as who can rule, and we see different arguments made in the secret history that it should always be Ögedei, but then we later get, well, you didn't abide by these decisions, so the line gets transferred to the Toluids. And there's efforts to sort of diminish the standing of the Jochids as a claim to ruling the entire empire. And of course, Chagatai is never even considered, but we see an effort to continually define and raise up the idea that only Chinggisids can be legitimate rulers. And this lasts. So that we see successor states, either you have individuals who try to link themselves to Genghis Khan through maybe marrying a Chinggisid princess or having a puppet Khan on the throne, or they establish their dynasty through a connection to Genghis Khan by like a general or someone who had served Genghis Khan. So there's always an effort to attach themselves to the charisma of Genghis Khan, one way or the other. And I think that ideology is very, very powerful and serves as sort of a framing effort for basically all the states after the Mongols, well, including, of course, the Mongols, but also non-Mongol states for centuries, really up until probably the 1900s.
Okay, that gives me, that leads me to an idea. You might have probably read the book of Turkish scholar Ayşe Zarakol, Before the West.
Yes, I have.
And her idea that, actually world order was before European world order, that is Mongolian, Pax Mongolica, and she claims that the international relations at that time was something that was going on between the house of Ugadei, Tului, Zuchids, Chagataids, and Ilkhans, etc. How would you describe that period? I understand geographically it was most of the known world, of course. But I mean, can you say that it was world order? I believe that many Mongol Khans, of course, they believed they were destined to rule the world by the order of the sky. In other words, they were Trumps of 13th century. So, would you believe in this kind of idea?
Yes, and I think that most scholars of the Mongol Empire have kind of had this idea, but I think Ayşe Zarakol does an excellent job in elaborating it for people outside of the study of the Mongol Empire, and also putting it in the terms of international relations. I was very impressed by the book and her arguments. And yes, I would say there definitely is a Mongol world order that is structuring relationships, but also we have to extend beyond that. It's creating a culture that others will adopt as part of their own ways of establishing their legitimacy. And it also evolves. It's not a stagnant method. So the Mongols are always, shall we say, evolving in how they interact with other states, how they legitimize themselves. And this is, I think, why it's able to last so long, is that they don't just come in and say, well, this is the way it's always been done, and that's how we're going to do it. They change with the times as needed, some better than others, but they're not a stagnant culture or society or political organism.
I often question myself why we call ourselves now Mongolians and why they are called Mongols. Are we different? Or sometimes I have feeling that Mongol in the 13th century was rather closer to Roman because You might be a Spanish, but a Roman citizen.
Mhm.
So you might be a Turk, you might be a Jurchen, but call yourself as a Mongol. We have a history of these English men who called himself as a Mongol, who was captured near Neustadt.
Yeah.
So the word Mongol at that time rather meant status than nationality. And I always surprised now why we do not call ourselves as a Mongols. Instead, we call Mongolians.
Right. Yeah, I do this myself. When I'm talking about the Mongol Empire, I always use Mongol. If I'm talking about modern Mongolia, and the Mongolian people, I always use Mongolian. And I think it's useful for scholars such as myself, and also students, because I think it helps makes a dividing line between the past and the more present, but also the states. Of course, the Mongol Empire is the Mongol Empire because they call themselves Mongol. And it's a term that spread. But of course, when they first appear, in many sources, they appear as the Tatars, because that was a name that was already in use in many areas. And then eventually people become aware that, oh no, they call themselves something else. They call themselves Mongol. And that begins to pick up in use over time. The Tatar never goes away in some areas, but we do see sources refer to Mongol and Tatar. But we also see in many sources that Mongol will be used, much like you said, in the sense of the Roman term. It's not just someone from Roman, it's someone from the empire, but it's usually referring to someone of nomadic origin. Most contemporary writers of the time will distinguish between, well, first of all, the groups of people they know, who they're familiar with, or who will identify to them, and basically say, no, I'm not a Mongol, I'm from China, or I'm a Kipchak Turk. But in many historical traditions, what they'll do is they will pick a term to describe the nomads and stick with that term. Like in Byzantine sources, basically any nomad often gets referred to as a Scythian, as a general term, despite the Scythians not being around for, well, by that point, 1,000 years. But we see this with the Turks. Everyone's a Turk, but the Kipchaks didn't call themselves Kipchak Turks. They were just Kipchaks or Kanglis. The Uyghurs were Uyghurs. They weren't Uyghur Turks. But Turk becomes sort of a synonym for any nomad. But then we get the Mongols, who are noticeably different from the Turks, and the Turks recognizing them as different. And even though there's some shared similarities in culture and practice, but maybe it's because of the language difference. But as we know, the polities of the nomads or tribes, if you want to use that word, were very fluid. So you didn't have to be an ethnic Mongol to be part of the Mongols. And with Chinggis Khan creating the Yeke Mongol Ulus, I really think that helps create that he wanted to create one people known as the Mongols. And that would include other nomads with a similar culture. I don't think, like, once they get too far out west with like the Alans, that they were really considering that, because the culture of the Alans, being an Iranian people, was different enough that it didn't work as well. But the Turkic groups, the Kipchaks, the Kanglis, all those could fit in nicely to that. But as we know, many of the labels would still exist afterwards, because it's hard to get rid of these old identities. But still, the Mongol identity became the dominant one. Of course, that's why Mongolia is because of that. I mean, there's no reason. Well, if Chinggis Khan had not existed, Mongolia might be known as Nymania or Karatia.
Or Tartaria.
Tartaria, yeah. I mean, and on many maps we see that it was referred to as Tartary, as they often put it. But yeah, I think it's a useful descriptor for the past, and with Mongolian as the present. And I do agree with your analogy with Mongol also being used in the same way as Roman could be used.
Германд үйл төрлөв. Эрүүл мэндэд чанарыг. Denk farm.
You know, I'm always puzzled to read Secret History of Mongols because historians claim that Naimans were definitely Turkic tribe, possibly Mirkits, maybe Kirates, even they. But when you read Secret History of Mongols, you find that Mongols and Kirates, Naimans, Mirkits, they are interacting with each other, and we don't see an interpreter going between them. So, what is your explanation for this? Was there a common language which was different from current Mongolian or Turkish, or were there Mongol tribes instead of being Turkic? What would be your proposition to that effect?
That is a great question. And I would say it's very complicated. For one, I don't know if the Secret History would ever mention that they were using translators, because there are instances where they are talking to other people and you don't see a translator, or they don't mention a translator with people who may not have been able to speak Mongolian, like with the Horazmian campaign and so forth. So I for one, I don't think a translator would have been mentioned. But also, I do think that there would have been some commonalities. That I do think that there were Turks out there. I think the Naiman were probably predominantly Turks, particularly when you look at the names of the rulers and things like that. I think the Karate probably were a little bit mixed. I would not be too surprised if the ruling elite might have been of Mongolian origin. But again, the structure of, I'm going to use the term tribes. I know some scholars don't like it, but I think that most people get the concept of it. These are fluid things. They're not locked into place. So you would see groups go back and forth, just like Genghis Khan enters the service of the Karate when he goes to Togrul. So we see some movement of people, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes not. So I think they're mixed. So over time, I think you do have people who are multilingual. I would not be surprised if some sort of, shall we say, a common language that blended Turkic and Mongolian together. I mean, we know there's a lot of loan words between the two languages. So I would not be surprised if that happened, that in some cases there was sort of a, I guess, a compromised language that we, like in the United States, there's something known as Spanglish, where you have a mixture of Spanish and English. And, people can get by in it. It's not, necessarily a language that people are having long, deep conversations, but, you're able to get by in it, make everyone's able to understand each other a little bit. I wish I was better at it, but it works. And we see this in many frontier areas or areas where there's multiple languages existing. If we look at the language of Urdu, Urdu comes from Ordu, or the camp, the palace, where you get the Chagatai Turkic, of Central Asia coming in, mixing with Hindi, mixing with Persian. I remember once I was reading the chronicles, the Tabikat Nasiri by Juzjani, that great source on the Mongols and other Muslim dynasties. And I was reading it because I thought it was Persian. Later, I realized when I saw a letter I didn't recognize, it was actually in Urdu. But because it was a medieval text, there were automatically a lot of Persian words, a lot of Turkic, a lot of Mongolian names. And so I had no idea that I was actually reading a language I didn't know. Because that's so you see this in these border areas. So I would not be surprised about that. But yeah, I think probably the western part of Mongolia was more Turkic than Mongolian. Not that they knew that they were Mongolian at the time, because probably the Tatars were probably predominantly Mongol. I used to think, and I think this is based off of previous scholarship, that the Tatars were probably more Turkic than Mongol, but now I no longer really believe that. I think probably the western portion was more Turkic, and then over time becomes more Mongolian, of course. And the Karaites, I think, were right in the middle of that kind of frontier of Eastern Mongolia being Mongolian and the western part being Turkic. And so you right in the middle, you have with the Karaite, you have that blending. And the Merkit, I honestly don't know.
Right. Well, you see, for example, the reason why I asked this question was when I read the history of Russia in 1500s at the river of Bug, Polish forces and the Russian forces were standing on the two banks of the river, and the history says that Polish started cursing Russians, and Russians got angry with that and started crossing the river. So it shows that language was, the languages were so close that Russians would understand.
Yeah.
Probably today, Polish and Russian are so different that you probably hardly understand each other.
Yeah.
And I thought that maybe in the 13th century, languages were close. And you know the long-standing dispute whether Sunnu or Hunnu were Turkic or Mongol.
Right.
So what is your opinion on that? Were they Turkic or Mongol?
I really don't know. My suspicion, I mean, let me back it up a little bit. I'm just going to leave it as I don't know. I have a general understanding of Hunnu history, but I would not call myself an expert, particularly with all the new material that's coming out, particularly with the archaeology and so forth. My suspicion is that the Hunnu were probably a little bit of both. And I guess it also depends on when do we think that the area had a Mongolian population? Because, of course, we're using Mongolian to refer to groups that would not have used that term. We know that Mongol as a term really begins to appear in the Tang period, or at the same time as the Tang Empire. But, if we're applying it to a language and a culture, that becomes a little bit tricky. As what do you define as that? Are we doing it based off of language? Are we doing it based off of culture? And the culture does not have to have the same language. So it becomes a little bit more complicated than I'm willing to establish an opinion on.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. Sometimes when you refer to these people of 2,000 years ago and dispute whether they were Mongols or Turks. That sounds to me dispute like who was Isaac Newton, New Zealander or Australian? Something like this. Sometimes
That's
you
a
come
great
across
example.
with hotheads in Kazakhstan who claim Genghis Khan was a Kazakh.
Yeah.
I
I've come
usually
across that as well.
I usually agree with them, and I say yes. Adam and Eva were Kazakhs too. Okay, that comes to my last question.
Okay.
It seems that Mongolian studies are subsiding around the world. If earlier you see a lot of centers of Mongolian studies around the world, now you don't see many. And some people claim that many centers of Mongolian studies shift rather to China. Would you agree with that? And what is, in your opinion, Mongolia should do to promote Mongolian studies around the world?
Well, that is, again, an excellent question. And it's one that is a little bewildering because you're right. There are fewer centers of Mongolian studies where you might find several scholars who deal with Mongolia. Yet at the same time, I think interest in Mongolia is higher than it's ever been before.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that has to do with an explosion of interest in the Mongol Empire. And that's leading to other people becoming interested in other things because of movies, because of YouTube videos, because of TV shows like Physical Asia on Netflix. That gained a lot of interest in Mongolia. I had a colleague who came up to me the other day and was asking me all sorts of questions about the Mongolian language because she was just enchanted with the way it sounded from that. And she studies the Middle East, so it was quite different for her. So I think there's a huge interest. I find students who are always fascinated in, but yet you're right. We have fewer studies or centers of Mongolian studies, but I feel like there are more scholars of Mongolian studies than ever before. It's just that, I'm the only one at my university who does it. And then at another university, there's going to be one other guy, and there's one. I think we're allotted one person who studies Mongolia at any university, no matter what it is, whether it's archaeology or history or political science or even biology, studying Mongolian wildlife. It just seems that way. One reason I think that is because of since the fall of or the end of the Soviet Union, where you had this, us versus them kind of mentality. We need to know everything about all the societies connected with the Soviet Union, whether it was in East Europe or Central Asia or Mongolia. That's what drove that. And there was government funding that took an interest in it. But now you don't have that. And for the life of me, I can't understand why people would not understand that this kind of knowledge is still important and still necessary for, whatever country you're in, that it would be good for your international relations, for your business strategy, for your economic policies, and of course, for national defense. But we also see weird trends in what universities and what the public and what the government supports in terms of study. For instance, the humanities is not very popular right now, even though I think it's ever more important. But you have parents like, oh no, they need to get a business degree.
All right.
Okay, they get they get, or IT or something like that. They don't know anything about the world, but go do business, but you just won't understand who you're dealing with, regardless of whether it's Mongolia or South America or something like that. And it's perplexing because you do have this popularity, and there is a craving, I would say, for information about Mongolia. I mean, just the number of things I see on Facebook or YouTube or, one of my favorite things to do is I keep my eyes open for shows that will reference Genghis Khan in some sort of way, or a book or something like that. They're always sneaking in there somehow. And they tend to be very popular episodes of shows or things like that. So there's definitely a curiosity about it, but it's weird that it is increased, but yet support for the study of Mongolia has declined. Now, as far as what can Mongolia do, I think one way is to boost support in places for it, like whether it's endowing a chair of studies. One of the reasons why China really increased its presence is because they were funding these Confucian institutes, which have since declined. But it boosted the interest. It supported that. Although there's always been a strong interest in China just because of the sheer size of not only the country, but also the population and everything else like that. But we see this a lot for some other countries where there's a strong support at particular universities for them because those countries have had citizens who have maybe they've like moved to America or England, but then they endow chairs for people to study that. Basically support the research, promote the teaching of that. And as we all know, Indiana University used to be a bastion of Mongolian studies, but they've made some weird choices over the years. So not to replace certain faculty members after they left. And they went from being, when you talked about Mongolian studies in the United States, you automatically thought of Indiana University. Now you can't really say that as much, even though they still have an excellent language program and other scholars involved with it. But it's sad. I went to Indiana and I loved it because of that. But yeah, I do think that if any of your listeners is a wealthy Mongolian who wants to endow a chair at a university that they like, or a scholar they like, or something like that, I won't say no. but really anywhere it would work. Another example is Western Washington University. That it's a school that has a wonderful library of Mongolian sources. And they've started a program where Mongolian scholars can come and teach for a semester or so, but they don't have a permanent position there, which also baffles me because it was a leader in that for a long time in I think the 70s and 80s, but in the 1990s, it sort of fell apart for whatever reason. It's weird, but also I would say that in the United States, there's a tendency to, if a program does not have a lot of students in it, often the higher administration says, "Oh no, we don't need that anymore. Students aren't interested." They don't. They're just looking at it from an accounting perspective, rather than a knowledge perspective or a scientific perspective, which you would think a university would do.
Өмнөд Хятадын халуун ширэнгээс Унгарын их тал хүртэл өргөн удам нутагт 20 их аяндан удирдаж 65 шийдвэрлэх тулалдаанд ялалт байгуулж Дэлхийн түүхэнд анх удаа тэв дамнсан байлдааны ажиллагааг төлөвлөн амжилтанд хүргэсэн Сүбэдэ Баатрын байлдааны арга барил Агаар газрын байлдаан нэртэй НАТОгийн байлдааны стратеги болон хэрэгжсэн түүхтэй. Энэ гайхамшигт жанжны тухай доктор Отгонбаярын төрөвсөн Сүбэдэ бүтээл хэвлэлтээс гарч уншигч таны гар дээр ирж байна. Домог болсон Монгол жанжныхаа гээгдсэн түүхийг сонирхон уншаарай.
Well, thank you very much, Professor, and we are grateful to you for still pursuing Mongolian studies despite all the difficulties. Of course, these were not all the questions that we would like ask from you, but we are limited in our time in our TV slot that we have, and we are hopeful that we will come back to you sometime in the future.
Oh,
Thank you
most
very
certainly,
much.
and thank you for having me. It's been
Yeah.
a delight.
Германд үйл төрлөв. Эрүүл мэндэд чанарыг Denk Farm.
Well, we came to the end of our podcast, and I would like to thank Professor Timothy May again. And certainly it was not all the questions that we wanted to ask him, and we are hopeful that he will come back to our podcast sometimes in future to answer all the questions that our viewers might have. And in case if you have questions to ask Professor May, please welcome to leave a comment on our page. Thank you.